And to finish with our marketing campaigns, we're going to discuss a little bit about tracking data online in digital environments and really briefly outline some analysis associated with the metrics that we're going to be tracking. So let's start with the beginning. At the end of the day, when you're making a decision in marketing, if you want to improve the decision making, what you need to do is improve the information that you use to make that decision, right? So the better information you have, the better decisions you're going to be able to make. Now, what has happened with traditional marketing is that making that connection between the decisions we make, for example, if you do an advertising campaign, and the outcomes that you actually find, that link between the decision and the outcome was oftentimes tenuous at best, right? It was hard for you to track how many people actually saw the advertising campaign and what kind of effects that campaign actually had and how it translated to sales. This connection and linkage has always been difficult to prove, right? Data was either hard to get or expensive, right? You needed to maybe do some surveys, or maybe you could do some experimental stuff in a lab setting, right? But in all cases, the real world does not convey really well with this idea of doing an action, grabbing information, and then testing whether it's working or not. On the other hand, in a digital environment, data is everywhere. And even if you're not trying, you're probably recording events, clicks, and all sort of very valuable information in your servers and computers, right? So at the end of the day, whereas in the real world, in the brick and mortar world, data is hard to come by, right? In the digital world, the problem that we end up having is that we have so much data that it's hard to parse through it. You end up having a data overload problem, right? Now, because of that, for example, you have this trend that's been going on now for about 20 years of this idea of big data, right? And big data comes in many ways, although at least in the primary way, from this digital environment where data is everywhere. And if you get into big data, which obviously this is not a class about, you will see that there are multiple reasons why big data arises, but the single largest aspect is the sheer volume of data. And that's why it's called big data. Although there might be other aspects, right? The speed at which the data comes through the pipeline might matter. The value associated with the data might matter. But at the end of the day, if you're running a business, this idea that you can use data to make better decisions, I think is common sense. The question is, how can you actually achieve it, right? And in general, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get all this data, and we're trying to basically uncover information that is valuable for us to make those decisions. To do that, what you're going to have to do is find patterns that are in the data, right? Look for trends, especially find unexpected things that are contrary to your expectations, but that are in the data, right? And then act accordingly, right? Make sure that you use that information when you're actually creating a new campaign so that you actually get better results from it. So what we're gonna do today is talk a little bit how you can go about this in an online environment. Good. So let's start with the beginning. Okay. Before you can act on data, you need to collect the data, right? So when we're talking about tracking in general, what we're referring to is what kind of metrics or variables are you going to be recording and maybe storing, in a hard drive, right? And somewhere, or a server that has a hard drive at the end of the day, right? Good. So one thing that is absolutely essential is for you to determine what variables or metrics are you going to be storing, right? We'll talk more about this later, but we have already outlined many of these variables. things like the number of pages viewed, right, where the visitor clicks in, right, the amount of time that it spends looking at a video, right? All these are going to be metrics that we're going to record and keep in a database somewhere. Okay. Now, one of the real challenges online is that the same person might use multiple devices to access information, and the same device might be used by multiple people to access information. So teasing out this multiplicity of users and multiplicity of devices is something that makes tracking individuals online somewhat challenging, in fact, fairly challenging, right? So at the end of the day, we're trying to do our analysis meaningful. We need to make sure that what we're doing is we're tracking individuals, because if two people are using the same tablet, for example, right, like let's say a husband and a wife, right, or a dad and a daughter, right, and what they end up doing in the tablet is going to be very different, and when you put it all together, the picture that you're going to get is going to be at the very best confusing and probably not very meaningful or useful for you to basically make sure that you optimize your marketing actions online. So this idea of tracking individuals and separating one individual from another and tracking that individual across multiple devices is something that Google cracked about 10 years ago, or at least did a fairly good job, I would say, with the idea of Google's Universal Analytics, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to describe what is the latest version of this Google Universal Analytics, which is in many ways the industry standard, and given the primordial role that Google has in the digital space, one way or the other, you're probably going to encounter. Now, the version that started just this year, it's called Google Analytics 4. So I'm going to discuss a little bit what the architecture is, how it works, and why it's actually useful. Now, Google Analytics 4, it's a step probably in the right direction, where Google has moved from looking at page views to actually look at these things called events. Now, I'm going to try to describe what an event is. An event is a more nuanced data than just a page view. So instead of looking at how many pages loaded for one user, what you are now doing is you are looking at what the user is doing within a page, right? You can do the same thing with apps, by the way, right? So once that the page is loaded, right, what Google does is it tracks, for example, your mouse, right, so that it knows where the mouse is. It also tracks where you click, right? And by labeling these different clicks, depending on the object that you're clicking in, it essentially enables you to have a very granular perspective on what the different users are doing, and then being able to report that and analyze it so that you can learn about the behavior of your visitors in an online environment, right? So you have these events, right, which are more nuanced interactions between the visitor and the page or the app, right? So you're going to have different event categories, right? So one event category maybe is clicking on an object. Another event category might be loading a page, right? Those are different events, right? And then within those different categories, like clicking on an object, right, there might be different actions that you can do, right? So there might be like different types of objects, and based on that, you have different actions, right? And let's say that in one page you have 3 videos, right? If you click in any of the videos, that will be all supposedly watching a video, right? But then you probably can provide a label for each of the videos to make sure that you can track which one of the videos is the one that is being clicked the most, right? And then finally, you can actually provide a value associated with each of those actions, right? So for example, if you click in video 2, that I'm gonna call the, I don't know, the new product video, right? The event value, for example, could be the amount of time that you spend running that video. So if after 10 seconds you move to the next page, the value for that event will be 10 seconds. It doesn't have to be time. It could be anything else, the number of times clicked, the number of characters entered, anything that can actually be recorded that is associated with the action that is taken for that event. It could be an event value. Now, if you're following my description, however limited it is, you can see that the granularity of the data gets really deep. So this really enables you a lot of flexibility in understanding what people are doing. Now, a way of aggregating this event data is this idea of a session, right? So a session within Google Analytics 4 is a certain amount of time where the user is being active within a page. There is usually a cutoff threshold that is assigned. So if the user doesn't interact with the page, but the page is loaded in the computer, let's say, for a period of time, typically 30 minutes, that session will end. But the session will continue so long as there is interaction between the user and the page. Okay, and of course, within that session, there is going to be typically multiple events that are going to occur, and Google is going to track that. So by nesting events within sessions, this gives you a very flexible architecture that enables you to capture visitor behavior, or in our case, customer behavior, with a lot of accuracy and flexibility when it comes down to understanding what the user is up to. Now, not only you can do this, but here is the beauty of GA4 and actually Universal Analytics in general, is that what Google enables you to do is to track the user across multiple platforms, right? So if I'm sitting in my computer, let's say my desktop, because I still have a desktop, I'm old-fashioned that way, right? And then later during the day, I go to my smartphone, which happens to have an Android operating system in my case, right? Google can track that I'm moving from one to another, and it can provide continuity of tracking, right? So I can start watching a YouTube video in my desktop and then finish watching it in my smartphone. And as I do that, all those events, every time I click or I swipe or I move in my smartphone, that gets recorded as maybe even the same session as we were in before with multiple events, right? So you can actually track individuals across devices, right? You're moving from just looking at cookies in a computer and that's where the data lives, to actually now tracking people across devices, right? And making sure that your data collection mechanism, as much as it can be, is user-centric, right? The way you use to do this, or at least the way Google does it, is by using this idea of Google Signals, which are basically unique tags associated with a user or an individual, right? And the way they do it is they leverage some of the Google services, like for example, Gmail or YouTube, right? You have a unique profile associated with you as a user, and every time that you log into a device with that login, you're basically tracked using the same Google Signal or code, okay? So this enables tracking users across devices and also tracking individuals if multiple users are using the same device, right? Good. They also enable you to track people without cookies, right? Cookies is a technology that, while still used, it has come down in usage dramatically because of a lot of the privacy concerns. There has been legislation established in multiple countries, especially in the European Union, that has limited the reach of these cookies as a technology, and that basically forces the user to provide permission for these cookies to be used, and because of that, a lot of platforms are switching from cookies to other technology like these sign-up signals. Okay. And finally, one of the exciting but maybe a little bit more high-tech functionality built within GA4 is this idea of machine learning. Basically, machine learning is the application of math models to the data that enables you to uncover information within data that a priori might be hard for somebody to just slice through, right? And what machine learning enables you to do, it's basically uncover trends, use predictive modeling to do different functions within the data, right? So you might, for example, be able to segment your users based on their behavioral tendencies, like the chances that they will click on a link, for example, can be used as a predictive probability so that you can create different segments of group of people. And of course, machine learning is highly flexible and technical, so it's way beyond the scope of what I want to discuss here. But let me know if you want to learn more. I'll be happy to discuss it with you offline. Now, there are many metrics that you can actually capture within Google Analytics, but most of the metrics have similar form, right? Most of them are counts. The number of times that something happens, number of clicks, number of times a page is loaded, right? These are all counts of something that is being recorded, right? And then what we do oftentimes is we take those counts and we create some sort of ratio, right? Like, for example, click-through rate. What does that mean? That is, of the number of total people that loaded that page, how many people clicked on a link, right? That is a ratio between two counts, right? One is the number of times that page was loaded. The other one is the number of times that somebody clicked on the link after the page was loaded, right? So you're going to have counts and you're going to have ratios. And sometimes a ratio might not be created for you automatically. Obviously, if you have the counts, you can do it yourself, right? And another thing that you're going to encounter is that oftentimes these analytics can be presented to you at different degrees of aggregation, right? So you're going to have the most aggregate, which is going to be typically at the page level, right? Or at the app level. So it could be, for example, the number of times an app has been downloaded. That would be an aggregate metric, right? And then it may be segmented. Like you can look at the same metric, number of times an app is downloaded, but now you can separate it by gender, right? So you can say males versus females, right? And that way you can now look at some sort of percentage so that you can see if gender actually plays a role in this, right? Furthermore, oftentimes we have data that is nuanced enough that enables you tracking at the individual level. So you can actually follow particular users through the conversion funnel to see what's working and what's not working. Good. Now, I'm going to try to be a little bit more concrete, but not completely down into the weeds so that we don't all fall asleep here. What kind of metrics are you going to find in Google Analytics 4? And I would say in most platforms in general. You're going to have user engagement metrics. What does that mean? Whether somebody's doing something within your page or your app, right? So these are going to be, for example, things like the number of sessions, right? That's the number of times that an app is loaded or a page is loaded, right? Another thing that you're going to oftentimes find is duration of the interaction, right? This is going to be amount of seconds or minutes that somebody spends within your website, for example, right? Another thing that you're going to find, both of the first ones were counts, but now you're going to also find bounce rates, right? Now, to define a bounce rate, you're going to have to define some sort of threshold, right? So, for example, in a page, after the page loads, if somebody leaves the page and before 2 seconds have gone by, then we'll consider that a bounce, right? And then what you're doing is looking at the number of people that loaded the page to the number of people that left the page within 2 seconds. So that will be a bounce rate. Okay, and again, you can define this in different ways, right? So if you are in a situation where, for whatever reason, the infrastructure is such or your website is such that loading times are high, then maybe the bounce rate definition needs to be updated, right? And then you will need to create your own bounce rate metric, because maybe the one that Google computes might not make so much sense given what it is that you're trying to do. But because you have the raw data for the number of people and you might have time that they spend on the page, you can still compute this. Good. What else? Number of page views, right? So somebody might go to your main website, but then they might actually go through the tree of the different options that you had, or information or pages that you have within your domain or main page, right? So you're going to have this kind of basic engagement metrics, and you might have others, depends on the platform, right? So if you're in a social media situation, you might have other engagement metrics. We've discussed some of those already. Okay, what else you're going to have? You're going to have user acquisition metrics, right? For example, you're going to be tracking where people are coming to your page from, right? So that you can actually see what's working and what's not working, right? So for example, you might see whether somebody's coming from an organic search engine, like somebody just typed in something and your name pop up, or if it's coming from an online advertising, right? So that's going to give you ideas, or it's going to enable you to compare the different tools that you're using to bring people or traffic into your site, what's working and what's not working, right? What else? You're going to be able to look at campaign performance metrics. What does that mean? Well, we've already gone through this, right? It's going to enable you to track people from early on, like it will be an impression, right? So it will give you a number of impressions, right? To number of clicks, which is going to be, you know, maybe at the consideration stage, and then maybe move into conversions. Now, oftentimes, what these systems are going to require is for you to define what conversion means. And it might require you to have multiple layers linked to your account. Like, you know, you might have to have a storefront, you might have to have an e-tail platform associated with it so that you can actually define a conversion. But assuming that you have all those in place, then you can define conversion as somebody actually buying the item, right? Instead of just putting in the cart or just going to the page, landing page, where the item is. Good. What other types of metrics do you have? You also have user behavior metrics, right? I've already discussed some of these, but you're going to have different types of events, right? It could be clicking somewhere, like a video, or, you know, filling in a form, or downloading a white paper, right? These are all events that enable you ultimately to understand how people are interacting with your site, right? And furthermore, you're going to have event categories, right? Like it enables you to classify the information into different groups so that you can see maybe patterns that are not obvious at a more disaggregate level. And then furthermore, it's going to enable you to allocate those events in a chain of things that need to happen before you can get to some sort of important milestone for you. Like, for example, let's just keep this simplistic, right? If you're trying to do funnel analysis, you might differentiate between when a page loads, when somebody clicks in an ad that it's in that page that loaded. That will be the second chain of events. The third one might be after they click on the page, right? Putting something into the cart. That will be the fourth event that goes in that chain that needs to happen, right? And the last one might be to check out, right? So there are 4 or 5 events that need to happen before you have a completed sale, right? So by defining events like this, it's going to give us a very clear picture into where the gaps are, right? If we see that people are clicking on the page, people are putting things on the cart, but people are not checking out, then that means that there is something happening in there. Maybe the way we are storing credit card information is problematic. Maybe filling out the forms is difficult. Maybe it's going to enable you to pinpoint problems that, if you do not define this in events, might actually be more difficult, and it will be more guesswork than instead of being driven by data. What else are you going to have? You're also going to have demographics and psychographic data about your audiences / users, right? You're going to see the typical stuff, right? Where do they come from, right? Geography, age. And when I say geography, I'm talking about IP address, right? I understand there are ways of disguising this, but most people don't use them. Things like VPN. So you have age, you have gender, but more interestingly for me as a marketer, you also have oftentimes interest data, right? Psychographics that are going to enable you to do maybe more nuanced profiles. If you have a persona that you have developed, now you can actually leverage that to compare the results that you're getting between what you think is your ideal customer and the customers that are actually buying your products, right? They're also going to enable you to do retention analysis, right? What you see if somebody keeps staying with you, an old user, somebody that's been buying already the product. You can provide lists about your current customers to Google, or Google can learn this from your prior interactions, people that have already completed sales with you, for example, right? Or they've been in your website before, a very typical metric to use here, okay? What else? You can do cohort analysis where you compare different subgroups that you create within the marketplace using a combination or a hybrid of these different metrics that I'm mentioning. And then finally, and maybe interesting to somebody like me in marketing, this idea of lifetime value metrics, right? That are going to enable you to track the value of somebody has with you over the long term. If marketing is about creating relationships with customers, this should be something that you should be looking at carefully. If you're taking 380 with me, you already know how to compute this. So Google is estimating this using similar metrics to the ones that I've discussed with you, that are based basically on financial analysis of assets, right? Good. And of course, it's an estimate based on information that you provide about how much people spend and how frequently they actually buy. But Google has a lot of data and it can figure some of these things out by actually tracking the users and see whether your assumptions about value are reasonable or not. Good. And then finally, in some cases, if you have, for example, a platform, some sort of e-commerce platform, you might be able to also track conversions, right? So you're going to have revenue metrics, you're going to have conversion rates. Again, conversion is going to be a function of what you define as a conversion, right? If all you're trying to do is having people sign in for your email campaigns, then that could actually be conversion. But if you define conversion as a sale, then you'll be talking about e-commerce, right? And the rate is basically the percentage of people that actually buy your product compared to the people that actually go to your site, right? And then finally, you're going to have other product performance metrics, like, for example, amount of sales, quantity sold, and total revenue associated with individual products. Okay, and now I'm going to outline the philosophy behind analysis in general of all this data that you're going to have. Of course, you should actually have already a tool set that enables you to conduct analysis that's way beyond the scope of this presentation, right? But take some stat classes. Hey, machine learning will be awesome, but maybe that's even unnecessary for what you're going to do, right? Some basic stats, understand what an average is, understand what differences between averages are, and look at how plots are created and what kind of plots are best for different types of data. That will be a good starting point for you to get into this. Now let me outline the philosophy though. The most important aspect for you is to pick the metrics that you're going to analyze carefully. You have so much data available that if you don't pick and choose, you're going to get lost in translation. Okay, so pick your KPIs. For each goal that you have, I would say 1 to 3 KPIs is what you want to do. Okay, maybe 3 is too many, depends how good you are and how complex the phenomena you're trying to optimize is at the end of the day. Right, now again, pick these KPIs based on the customer journey that we have outlined so many times. And understand that even though KPIs are not good or bad in themselves, given a goal, not all KPIs are created equal. Let me give you a silly example. If you're interested in increasing awareness for a brand, okay, then the number of impressions is a very useful KPI or metric. On the other hand, the same KPI or metric, number of impressions, is a lousy metric if you're interested on increasing sales for a product, right? They are weakly correlated. There are many things that need to happen between being aware of a product or a brand and buying the product or the brand. And you need to track metrics that are closer to the event that you're interested in. And if it's a complex event like sales, you might need to track metrics in multiple stages of that customer journey to make sure that you can identify where the gaps are. Okay. So again, pick your KPIs based on the goals. If they are complex goals like sales, you might have to have intermediate KPIs so that you can pinpoint gaps. And then the tracking is going to be more complex because it's going to involve more KPIs. Good. Now, what do? You track these metrics over time and across audiences, right? And you need to have some time of basically benchmarking these KPIs, where you have an idea of what is normal, what is the standard, what is what you should expect, right? Because what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to see whether the actions that we undertake, like for example, if you have a new advertising campaign online, right, in a certain page, right, you're trying to see if it moves the needle. But for you to see if the needle is moving, what you need to do is you need to benchmark what is normal and see what that action is doing, right? So you need to create some sort of standard or standards if you have multiple KPIs that are going to enable you to set an expectation against which you're going to judge whether the actions that you're taking from a marketing perspective are working or not working. And if they are not working, hopefully we can pinpoint why. Okay. So to do this, again, you need to give enough time. And of course, this varies depending on the sample sizes that you can accrue, right? If you're a really large brand and you're talking about thousands of hits per hour, then you probably can move quickly into looking at different campaigns because you're going to be able to accrue sufficient data in a couple of days to set your standards. On the other hand, if you're a new company and most people don't know you and you only have 20 to 30 interactions a day with users, then maybe accruing that data might take a couple of weeks or longer. Okay, so make sure that you are realistic and you have a sufficient sample size to make sure that what you're finding is not just an idiosyncrasy of the fact that it's Monday, the first of the month, and because of that, I don't know, because of that people have their first paycheck and they can go and buy, whereas the rest of the week maybe you'll find very different behavior. Whatever it is that makes sense with your data, but give it sufficient time. And then after that, what you're trying to do is you're trying to find what's moving the needle. You're trying to find these deviations from expectation, and that's going to take different forms depending on the type of data that you're looking at, right? So if you're looking at data over time, you're trying to see whether the trend changes, right? Where is there a break in the trend, right? Where does the slope of the curve change, right? Or maybe the sign of the curve altogether, if it goes from negative to positive or positive to negative, whatever it is, right? And of course, for you to ascertain what is a proper deviation, typically you want to use some sort of statistical technique that enables you to account for the fact that there is always sampling error, right? So you're going to have to do some sort of testing, Okay, now most people that look at this kind of data, in my experience, they don't do that. They just go by the results. And the moment that they see a positive result, they assume that that's going to be something that it's going to work in the long term. But you usually need to give sufficient time, sufficient data points to make sure that that's properly done. And there are techniques that you can use for this, again, beyond the scope of this presentation. Okay. Finally, another thing that can help you identify these breaks on the trend, seeing this in raw data form, in table form, it might be very difficult to do, if not impossible. You can actually use data visualization techniques to look at this. And the most basic Google Analytics tools have already some built-in data visualization, like you can see here, right? So here you have a series of time series, right? So you can actually see whether there's a trend or not. In this case, you can see that most of these don't have an obvious trend, right? But they do have some seasonality, right? So you could actually talk about what's happening here by looking at the data, right? So they give you more insight into what's happening, right? It's not growing, but it seems like it fluctuates in some pattern that maybe is discernible, tells you something about what's going on, right? Sometimes the capabilities of the basic, well, I say basic is not basic at all, but of Google Analytics, for example, may not be sufficient. You can export the raw data and you can use dedicated data visualization software. Like here you have a picture of Tableau, which is probably the industry standard if you're talking about data visualization. Now, the downside of some of these third-party apps is that they are expensive, especially Tableau is expensive, right? It's very nice. I'm not trying to say anything bad about it. It's probably the best if you're looking at what you can do with it, but not cheap. So if you're a starting company, maybe this is not an option. But there are intermediate things, right? If you need to do something beyond what Google Analytics can do, you can export the data and then you can put it into some free software like R, for example. And R has really nice libraries for data visualization. The downside of R is that it's not very user-friendly, at least compared to Tableau or what Google Analytics has built in, right? So what these techniques are going to enable you to do is, for example, observe things that maybe are harder to see in the raw data. And that's as much as I'm going to talk about basic analysis. If you want to get better at analysis, you're going to have to learn some sort of modeling, whether it is econometrics, whether it is statistics, whether it is machine learning, artificial intelligence, which sounds more exciting, but it's a lot of machine learning at the end of the day. And that's all I have for you guys for today.